Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast. My name is Chris,
And my name is James.
and we are the Formula One Bros.
Just two twins with a love of F1 to share our thoughts on everything in the world of Formula One.
And we are back recording here on the Monday evening after a great Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, and finally a Saudi Arabian Grand Prix seemingly that was as minimal on controversy in terms of the actual circuit and Grand Prix and track and everything. It seemed like just to be a straightforward Grand Prix race, but obviously lots of controversies taking place with Red Bull and Mohammed Ben Sulayem off track, which I covered in our previous episode. But we're here to talk about the 2024 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. So, James, what did you think of the race?
I thought it was a pretty good race. I would say it wasn't the most exciting Saudi Arabia Grand Prix that we've seen. That definitely was 2021, the first year that we raced there. With the ending between Max and Lewis. I think that was definitely one of the most exciting races that season. But it wasn't the most exciting Saudi Arabia Grand Prix, but it was still a pretty good race. Max, out front, Max and Checo kind of ran away with it, but behind the two of them, it was pretty good racing all the way throughout. Good battles that lasted quite a while. The drivers were really competitive on the track and made for some really great racing. I really enjoyed watching it, even though Max and Checo kind of ran away with it. But it was a fun race to watch. I was happy that was the race that it was for the second race of the season. But I'm really excited for Australia.
Yeah, I'm excited for Australia too. I think it was a good race. It confirmed a couple things for us, a couple things that we had hunches about, a couple things that we'd already been thinking about. And it was a pretty docile race, which is good for Saudi Arabia considering 2021 had all the drama that it had, and then 2022 had the missile strike and just lots of stuff. But this year seemed to be a little bit better, and I will say, yes, Max Verstappen had the absolute soul crushing domination that we have come to expect from him, but Sergio Perez coming home in second, only 11 seconds off the lead.
Let me look. It was 13
seconds off the lead.
Good.
But that's pretty good. Yeah. That's exactly what you want from Sergio Perez. That's exactly what you've hired him to do. And that for most of 2021 during Max's championship battle, that was the driver that Sergio Perez could be, is to be there or thereabouts and come home, bring home maximum points. He was able to get by Charles Leclerc and was able to withstand the pressure early on in the race. But after the safety car, he just kind of took off, and Max, the top three, really, Max, Sergio, and Charles, were all kind of just in a league of their own. But yeah, he drove a really good race, well managed, and I think we talked previously about Sergio Perez needs to get off to a good start. I think he still has some qualifying things to figure out, but he did much better this weekend in qualifying, starting third compared to fifth from last weekend, and he made quick work of Charles in the race, and then never looked back. Came home a comfortable second in the Grand Prix. So good for Sergio.
Yeah, he's definitely driving like he understands the position that he's in. With other drivers really wanting that seat, other drivers that could take that seat. But yeah, he's done everything that he's been asked to. He did everything that he was asked of in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And great drive.
And one thing that we talked preseason about specifically with Sergio is that is he going to be Red Bull's undoing if everybody has gotten quicker the way that we think that they have, and if it's going to be more competitive. Obviously, I think we made these comments before we actually saw the Red Bull for this year and really saw it on track. But we thought if anything is going to be Red Bull's undoing this year, it was going to be Sergio Perez's pace. And that's and for him to come home second on a weekend like that, where Ferrari is hampered by not having Carlos Sainz, Mercedes had a down weekend, McLaren was compromised by strategy, Aston Martin actually looked pretty quick but couldn't put it together in the race.
Yeah.
Just had a weird strategy thing. I think both of them went really long on the mediums,
Well,
and
Lance Stroll crashed out.
yeah, Lance Stroll crashing out, and then I think Fernando Alonso was one of the ones
Yeah.
that went long on the mediums, and
Yeah.
so on a weekend where their competitors didn't have really what I think would be representative weekends. Especially considering Ferrari, is their next nearest challenger so far for the season. I think Sergio Perez did everything that is needed, and I think he's making currently. Granted, it's only been 2 races, but in these 2 races, he's made a very good case for him to keep his job.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah,
So,
it's
and
been
that makes the dynamic between them interesting now that Max Verstappen to Mercedes is seeming increasingly likely, but that's a whole other podcast episode that we
yeah,
can talk about.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so moving on down the way, I was really impressed. I think the racing, really the racing between it was the battle. It was like from 11th to like 15th or 16th with like Esteban Ocon, Alex Albon, Kevin Magnussen, Logan Sargent, and Yuki Tsunoda was
Oh, really
absolutely
good.
incredible. And it was incredible the entire race. There was some great racing, particularly it was a racing between Yuki Tsunoda and Esteban Ocon was in there. Alex Albon, that battle at the front of that sort of midfield pack there, trying to get everybody trying to get by Kevin Magnussen. That was some incredible racing.
It was
And of
very,
course,
very, very entertaining to
it
watch.
was it was racing that ultimately ended up in some penalties for Kevin Magnussen, but it was an incredible racing to watch.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. That was really, really fun. And like I said at the beginning, it wasn't really like exciting from the front of the grid, but
Mm-hmm.
from the towards like the middle and the back, man, there was some
Yep.
really great racing going on all the way around.
Yep. And of course, unfortunately, we did have our first 2 retirements of the 2024 season. We talked already. Lance Stroll had crashed out in his Aston Martin.
Yeah.
Just lost it on his own, ended up in the barrier. And
Yeah,
that is what brought out
he
the safety car on lap 10.
on one of the, like, it was like a left-hand corner, he like just
Mhm.
brushed the wall and then that pushed him wide and then broke his suspension that went
Yeah, it was
off
like the
into it.
second of that. It was like the second of those 2 chicanes on the backstretch, like
Yeah.
after the DRS zone. He
Yeah.
brushed the inside of the wall and then just his suspension was gone and ended up in the barrier. And something that actually we didn't see a lot of, but on the first lap, there was some contact with Pierre Gasly and ended up having to retire the car. I think it was all like on lap 1, right? At the start.
Oh gosh, I can't remember. I tuned in like I tuned in on like by like lap 3
Mhm.
after I think it was on the way to the grid. Something happened on the way to the grid
Yeah.
with him. I don't think it was at the start. I want to say it was on the way to the grid.
Yeah. But that was something that just kind of like got lost in a little bit, but
Yeah,
Pierre
I know. I was
Gasly
like,
out.
it was like lap 4, and I looked at like it said Gasly DNF, and I was like, what did I
Yep.
miss?
Yep. But ultimately it was Lance Stroll that brought out the safety car, which everybody decided to pit on. Everybody except for Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton pitted for hard tires, which pretty much locked in a race of tire conservation from
Mhm.
there on out. So I think after that safety car moment, it was tough. Now it did create some interesting racing at the very end between Ollie Behrman, Lewis Hamilton, and Lando Norris, because
Yes.
they had pitted, ended up behind Ollie Behrman, but they had to go long on the mediums. So Ollie Behrman was able to get by them, and then they pitted for softs, so they had the tire advantage, but Ollie Behrman was able to hold them off till the very end, and was in the last like 10 to 15 laps. They were really hunting down Ollie Behrman, and it only ended up being a gap of like 2 seconds between Behrman and Norris at the very end. So that battle at the very end was very intriguing, and I was just screaming at my phone for Ollie Behrman towards
Yeah,
the
it
end of
was
that race. It
only
was
a couple
incredible.
seconds separated
Mhm.
Behrman, Norris, and Hamilton. And then
So
Behrman wasn't too far off from George Russell either.
No, he wasn't. Russell was able to, obviously Russell was putting some distance between himself and Behrman just because,
Yeah.
Behrman was so new to the car. But we have to talk about Ollie Behrman.
Yeah.
So Carlos Sainz, it ended up being diagnosed with appendicitis on Saturday morning, which means he took part in FP1 and FP2 while having appendicitis. And he was managing the symptoms with fever suppressors and painkillers. And when that stopped working, they took him to the hospital and he had his appendix removed. We are very fortunate to say that Carlos Sainz is recovered, and whether or not he's going to be in
the race, he was back at the track before the race started.
He was back at the track on engineering duties during the race. Whether or not he is ready to go for Australia, I imagine he will be, because we have 2 weeks off before Australia. But we're just happy that Carlos Sainz is okay. But that made way for Ferrari's reserve driver of Ollie Behrman getting the nod. He had FP3 and qualifying, and those are the only laps that he had before he jumped in the car for the race. And only having FP3 qualified like less than a tenth slower than Lewis Hamilton, and missed out on Q3 by like
it was
less
so
than
close.
a tenth.
Yeah, it was so incredibly close. And then in the race, he just had a monster of a race, finishing what was it, 7th place?
Started 11th, finished 7th.
Finished 7th.
Points on his debut for Ferrari. He's the first British driver to drive for Ferrari since Nigel Mansell, and he is the youngest person ever to drive for the Prancing Horses. So
yeah, absolutely monster of a weekend for him. That's something that he'll hold on to for a very, very long time.
Yeah. And of course, naturally, because F1 fans are the best fans, voted him driver of the day, and it could not be more deserved.
I totally agree.
Absolutely amazing drive, very mature. He talked a little bit in the press conference about, he wasn't able to get by Kevin Magnussen in the early stages of the race, which I think had compromised him a little bit. So obviously Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hulkenberg just using their experience to hold him up. But which is going to come with experience and time. And obviously, Kevin Magnussen has been in this sport for since 2014, with the exception of 1 year. So that was obviously, but Ollie Behrman is still driving a Ferrari compared to a Haas. And so he was always going to get by. It was just a matter of when. And after that, drove a very measured and controlled race, picked up the most points that he could, which is all really anybody can ask. And even in
the having the pressure of having Lewis Hamilton and Oscar Piastri, or was it Lando Norris? I can't remember.
Lando Norris.
So 2 very, very talented drivers, all charging after you on fresher tires, on faster tires, and still being able to stay cool, calm, and collected, and come out ahead of those 2, especially Lewis, was just such an incredible weekend for him.
Yeah, it was great.
What a race.
It was great. And if you listen to his radio, his radio communication, it seemed very calm and very measured. He was asking very mature questions to his engineer about everything. And, just a very mature drive from somebody who literally had to give up their F2 pole position to race, like literally had to forfeit the F2 weekend after getting pole to race for Formula One. I mean, what an incredible story, and hats off to you, Ollie Behrman. That was absolutely incredible. What a great drive. And I know will for always and ever be, from here on out, no matter what happens in his future, a Ferrari legend. So awesome job. That was, a great, that was, the most fun to keep track of and the most fun story from the weekend.
I know. It made my heart happy. And it kind of just reminded me the future is bright for Ferrari.
Yeah, it is. The future is bright. I mean, obviously the future is very bright in the next 3 years with Charles and Lewis, but I think this very well could be a situation. And Ollie Behrman has already done some testing for Haas. He's done several FP1 outings for Haas during the season. He's done tire testing for Haas. So he's very familiar with the grid, the Ferrari power unit, and is very highly regarded in the Ferrari driver academy. So I think this is definitely going to be starting to I think he's starting to put a stamp on his future with Ferrari, and I think this is going to have major implications, not for next year, but for what happens after Lewis Hamilton inevitably leaves Ferrari and retires.
Yeah.
Is it going to be, wins the championship in 2025 and then dips? Is it going to be 2 years? Is it going to be 3 years? After his current deal is up? We don't really know. But I say you stick Ollie Behrman in a Haas for a couple years, and then when Lewis Hamilton's retired, you have a very, very capable young driver ready to make the move to the top team. And I think that's something that they're going to be looking at for the future. So
absolutely.
This weekend, though, it kind of seemed like a last minute pinch hit for Carlos Sainz. I think this is going to have major implications for beyond 2026, I think, or whenever Lewis Hamilton decides to hang it up. So other thoughts on the race? Anything else that caught your eye? Anything else that you noticed?
Well, I remember after last race, we had a very, very, we had a fireworks show between Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda. And that seemed, at least this week, seemed to have calmed down a bit. Yuki Tsunoda, where did he finish? He finished 14th, Daniel Ricciardo in 16th. So they still both out of the points, but they stayed away from each other pretty much the entire race. There wasn't really a whole lot of drama. I know after what happened in Bahrain with the two of them, I was very curious to see how that would carry over into this weekend. And it seemed like it really didn't. Yuki Tsunoda has matured a lot, and obviously Daniel Ricciardo is an extremely mature person. So it was they probably talked it out at the end of the race with their engineers, the team, and everything. And then it's probably just water under the bridge now, on to the next race. And so it seemed like it was old news, which is good.
Yeah, I think so. And also, they both of them were caught up in that like bottom of the pack battle between, all of them, the RBs, and then, and being held up by Kevin Magnussen. So they were all caught up in that, and it just kind of seemed business as usual between them. I think, of course, it was, the results were 14th and 16th. So there's not a whole lot of stuff to really have a lot of tension. And also, the position last week was for 13th or 14th position. So kind of going on with them and the RB, that car does seem to be a little less competitive than we thought it was after testing. So I think I would actually adjust my order and say that, Haas and Williams are probably clear of the RBs. At this current stage. So
I would say so too.
I would say
Alex Albon finished 11th.
Right. I would say I would say in terms of, pecking order now, obviously you have Red Bull at the top, Ferrari second, McLaren third, Mercedes fourth.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about, and we'll get into it in a little bit, Mercedes troubles. Then I would say Aston Martin emphatically fifth, could potentially even on a good day battle for fourth fastest with Mercedes. And then I think after that you have Haas and Williams right thereabouts, and then you have RB, Kick, Sauber, and Alpine right at the very bottom.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely how I based off of their performance, that's definitely how I see the order too.
Yep.
But speaking of that Mercedes.
Oh yeah. Oof. Yeah, that Mercedes. Well, it wasn't I think per se, because I think both of the drivers have definitely both of the drivers have definitely said that the car is much more improved. It's a lot easier to handle. And I do think that they have a really good platform to work with. And I think with some really good development this season, they 100% can be faster than McLaren, and they could even potentially be as fast as Ferrari. But and I think Hamilton's results were a little bit compromised considering the strategy that he was put on because of the safety car having to go long on the mediums, and then, being on the softs at the very end and being held up by Norris and Behrman. But, George Russell ended up fourth or fifth? somewhere about there.
Yes, fifth.
It was so, a weekend about where you'd
Sixth, sorry,
expect
sixth.
six, about where you'd expect. I think still a little bit, and he was behind Piastri, correct? If I'm remembering that correctly.
Yes, Piastri was
Piastri
fourth.
fourth. Yeah, so I think the McLaren is still a little bit faster. Both Mercedes ended up behind the McLarens that they were battling with on track, but I think Lewis Hamilton's ninth place is not the most flattering position in the world, and I think he is obviously much more capable. And on a good weekend, he could, top five.
Yeah.
So they're not a million miles away, but it's the straights where McLaren is well, I mean everybody, but particularly McLaren because they're their closest competitor right now, and even Aston Martin are faster than Mercedes right now, and it's the straights. And so I think it's just they have a drag problem.
Yeah, but I think what's good though, I will say what's good is last year and the year before, Mercedes, like pretty much the entire philosophy of the car was completely messed up.
Nope.
They completely missed the mark on it.
Yep.
And so if they were going to fix it throughout the year and make significant improvements, it was going to be a lot. They're basically going to have to change the whole car. Hello, Kitty. But this year, it seems like the concept of the car is a lot better. They're just dealing with downforce issues, which that they can. I am confident that Mercedes, being Mercedes, and being the team that has won all those championships in a row, I think that they could find a way to figure it out. And I think towards the end, they could pull a McLaren in the second half of the season and be very, very dominant.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen it before. I mean, I think the next closest example of a team that has struggled with the same things that Mercedes is dealing with was Ferrari in 2020 and 2021. And we saw, granted, it was a lot tighter back then just because of the COVID restrictions, but we saw, over the course of 2020, they were able to get to the point where Sebastian Vettel was on the podium in Turkey, and then in 2021, Leclerc was doing Herculean feats in that car, qualifying at like fourth and the final rounds in that season, I think as high as fourth. I think, what was it? Was it Qatar? He qualified like fourth or something.
I can't remember.
I can't remember. It was one of the races at the it may have been Abu Dhabi, but it was one of the races at the very end of the season where that car, a Ferrari that had no business being anywhere near the top.
It was Qatar. I think it was Qatar.
So, and that's a team that greatly improved over the course of those two seasons. So it's definitely something that Mercedes 100%, and they have the engineers to be able to do it. It's Mercedes. You can never count out Mercedes. Well, maybe a little bit, but that it seems like it's a now problem, and they have a really, really good read on the car. I think Saudi Arabia exposed their weakness, and it is always going to be a track that is going to expose. If you have a draggy car, it's always going to expose that weakness.
It's such a fast racetrack. Yeah. If you have a car that's struggling in the straights, that one's going to eat you alive.
Yep. And it's a track that also has a lot of high-speed corners, a lot of long straights. And so
you need a lot of downforce.
Right. And it's going to be a track that is going to benefit their competitors in McLaren and Ferrari, two teams that go well at high-speed circuits, technical difficulties here. Ferrari and McLaren, how well they've gone on at like tracks like Monza and Spa in the past. Like it's always going to be a track that was going to favor them. So I think they've got a good read on the car, and I don't think that this is I think this is probably going to be a circuit to circuit problem. Like when we go to Australia in 2 weeks, that problem is probably going to be very much more minimized because it's more of a street circuit. When we go, especially when we go to, Monaco, it's not that problem is not even going to be close to mattering in Monaco. So I don't think it's very circuit specific, and they'll be fine.
Yeah, I think so too. But it's definitely encouraging that that's the only thing that they're really struggling with right now, because it's a fixable problem.
Right.
It's not like this car, the philosophy of this car is completely wrong and we need to completely change the car.
Yeah.
It's not that, which is good.
Yeah. Another thing that I do want to mention specifically, just because we haven't talked about them a lot, and this was a huge talking point last week, was Alpine and how poor their performance was in Bahrain. I think Bahrain exaggerated the problems with the car. But Esteban Ocon, he was up in that battle between Yuki Tsunoda and Kevin Magnussen and Alex Albon, and he was up in that battle for a long time and had some really great moves. He was able to keep up.
He finished a very respectable 13th.
Yeah, he
for
finished
how
13th.
that car was in Bahrain.
Yeah, he finished behind Kevin Magnussen and Alex Albon, which was always going to happen. But considering how poor they did in Bahrain, that's a great result for Esteban Ocon. And mainly just because the car looked more competitive this weekend.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because of the results. It's obviously nowhere near where Alpine wants to be or should be. But he looked much more competitive. Obviously, they didn't have Pierre Gasly in the race at all. So it's hard to get a read for Alpine, but the car looked a lot more competitive. I still think that if your benchmark for being a works team in F1 is Alpine, F1 should for always and forever be embarrassed that they're leaving out Andretti. But that is a conversation for another day that I really don't want to get into. But
yeah,
speaking specifically on Alpine, I think they had a much better weekend. Obviously, they would have liked to have had both cars up there, but it looked like Saudi Arabia, and I think they're going to be disappointed because Saudi Arabia looked like a track that was going to benefit them more, and not having Pierre Gasly in the race is gonna hurt them a lot. But hopefully this is a sign of good things to come. It seems like a pretty trouble-free weekend for Alpine with their new structure in place. So I think don't call it a comeback, but I think they're definitely starting to get themselves sorted out.
Yeah, I would agree.
So let's go through a little bit and just kind of catch up on in the Saudi Arabian Grand Preview episode, which if you're watching along on YouTube is not here, but if you're listening along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iHeartRadio, you will have access. You'll have access to hear the previous episode, which was audio only. We talked about a couple lines, a couple storylines, a couple that we'd already touched on, which was the high-speed circuits, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, and how that is going to happen. But the main thing that we're always going to start off our episodes with until the problem is resolved and goes away is, does the ongoing controversy around Red Bull distract from the racing or impair the race in any way? The answer to that question is an emphatic no.
No.
Considering how
too.
Considering how dominant that weekend was,
can't get much better than that.
It certainly does not seem to be affecting their on-track performance, but it is a huge problem. And now you have rumors that Helmut Marko is going to be leaving the team, may already be suspended, and that he might have even been the leak for all of this stuff. The fact. So this ongoing thing is you have what is rumored to be team personnel leaking this information about an investigation that was already not transparent, when everybody in the most people in most other teams in the Formula One grid are asking for more transparency. I would say, I'm very confident in saying the whole F1 fandom is asking for more transparency with Red Bull. You have all of these things going on, and you have, team personnel that maybe could be potentially leaking this information. You have Helmut Marko is like, I'm out of a job. And then Max Verstappen now subsequently is like, Toto Wolff has been singing Max Verstappen's praises this week. This past weekend, saying, we'd love to have him in a Red Bull or in a Mercedes. Obviously that you're going to be looking at him if he leaves. They're already talking about him leaving and going to another team in 2025. And Max Verstappen doing relatively little to deny it. Obviously that's just I'm racing for Red Bull this year. This is where my focus is, that kind of answer. But
he hasn't denied it though.
Yeah. So all of this is just so weird. And of course, all of this is coming about on the weekend of International Women's Day, which is just, if you're Red Bull, super embarrassing, man. Like it is.
It looks really bad.
It looks so bad, and it is absolutely shameful. And then you have the news that the Red Bull team had suspended the person that made these allegations against Christian Horner. And like, this is me beating my head against my microphone. It is absolutely insane what is happening at Red Bull
have
right
you
now.
seen the Apple TV series show, The Morning Show?
No, I have not.
It's God, it's like I'm watching that show over again. It's insane.
It's just insane. And if you didn't see, I think most F1 fans have seen it. It's gone viral on TikTok. Laura Winter, who is an F1 pundit for F1 TV and is absolutely amazing at her job. She's incredible at what she does. And she did a spot on that for International Women's Day.
Oh, God, it
And
was so good.
blatantly calling out what is happening at Red Bull, but so eloquently taking the time to 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 bring to the front what we should be talking, which is the amazing contribution of women in F1.
I mean, and over the weekend too, we got to see the first F1 Academy race too.
I was just about to say the F1 Academy was back this weekend and it was incredible. I want to talk about that at the very end of the segment. I want to keep this on Red Bull, but you know, Red Bull has these crushingly dominant weekends and it's all of this off track stuff seems to not be affecting them for now, but I just have a feeling that if one too many dominoes falls, that may change.
It's gonna end up exploding in their face at some point. And as our Lord and Savior Taylor Swift said, trash always takes itself out.
Yeah, it does.
And it's gonna blow up in their face. Something bad is gonna happen to that team. Something is gonna happen.
Another thing that I feel very compelled to say before we move on from this topic is in 2020, after the COVID pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and the subsequent protests about racial inequality, and how Lewis Hamilton was very vocal about F1's lack of attention to these moments and overall lack of diversity, you had this amazing We Race as One campaign where all of the drivers say, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, we race as one. Flash forward to this weekend, and all of this stuff is coming out about Red Bull suspending the person that had made these allegations, and all of the backlash that comes from that. Several drivers and team personnel throughout the weekend felt the need to take time out of their day to say that all of this is a distraction and we should be focused on racing. I'm sorry. What? That
Shameful.
That is ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. And there's a reason why
they're just trying to get the target off their back. That's all that is.
Exactly. Or that you know, I don't know what it is, if they don't feel comfortable talking about these things, or you know, they're tired of being asked about Red Bull and Christian Horner, whatever it is. But there's a reason why all of these calls for equality, particularly surrounding women in this sport, are happening. It's because of reactions like this. Why these conversations are so necessary.
Yeah. One thing that I love though is when this news first broke a couple weeks ago, I guess about a month ago now, James Vowles was asked in a press conference, or I guess in a media interview, he was asked about it, and he gave the perfect response. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he gave the perfect response to it. And I think we all need to be more like James Vowles.
Yeah, and there are the good people out there. I know Zach Brown has been calling for much more transparency. And
oh yeah,
of course, with Zach Brown, you know, I always kind of take what he says with a grain of salt, because I think everything that he says is a political maneuver, much more than coming from a place of, you know, being genuine in what he says.
For sure.
But you know, that's the American in him. But yeah, so anyway, I don't want to talk about it too much, but it was just the story surrounding everything was absolutely insane. And I join, first of all, the whole F1 community and saying that we just need more transparency from Red Bull. And the fact that it is, obviously there are things that we can't talk about and that won't be discussed because of legal means or whatever. But just still, we know nothing and we're left to speculate everything, and that is not the way something like this should be handled, particularly when you're dealing with allegations of inappropriate behavior and the person that made those allegations has now been suspended from the team. Like, that's ridiculous. Anyway,
Yeah.
back to the original point of, is that going to distract Red Bull on track performance? So far, no. But
It
I
probably
think
will at some point.
it probably will at some point, and I think it's going to be worth keeping an eye on throughout the season. The next is, can Ferrari, the next thing that I mentioned was if Ferrari, whether or not Ferrari was able to have a representative weekend without any technical problems that we saw in Bahrain from Leclerc. And I will say a couple things. I'm going to say yes and no to that, because obviously Leclerc had a very representative weekend with him setting fastest lap on 40 lap old hard tires at the very end of the race on the last lap. But it wasn't a representative weekend per se for Ferrari. I think they'll definitely be hurting for Carlos Sainz, but I don't want to talk too much about that because I don't want to take away from what Ollie Behrman did.
Yeah, I mean, Ollie did the best that he could. It'll be nice to have Carlos back in the car though, come Australia, and to really, I think this will be the first time that we'll really be able to see what that Ferrari can do because of the Charles Leclerc's issue and in Bahrain. This happened in Saudi Arabia, so this upcoming weekend will really be the first weekend that we'll see Ferrari, hopefully, be able to really show what that car has. And I'm excited to see what that could, what
so I think
in store for that.
I think the two teams that we're really going to need to see have a representative weekend in Australia are going to be Aston Martin and Ferrari. I think those are the two teams. Because Aston Martin had a good weekend in Bahrain, but I think they're very, very quick, but they still have some things that need to be confirmed. And they need Lance Stroll to finish the race. They need both cars to finish the race. And then Ferrari just needs to not have problems with one of its cars. So that's just kind of the way that it is. But I don't want to talk about much more because I don't want to take away from what Ollie Behrman did, because what he did was incredible. And he's forever and always going to be a Ferrari legend.
Yep.
The next thing that I asked, what we already talked about, tension between the two RB drivers. The next thing on the list was, can Logan Sargent and Nico Hulkenberg bounce back after a rough start to the season due to incidents on track? Haas, especially considering they need to confirm tire problems. Specifically, Nico Hulkenberg. Yeah, obviously he scored a point for Haas.
Which that hasn't happened in a while.
And then in broader terms for Haas, finishing P10 and P11 on the track, P10 and P12 after penalties. We've already talked about Haas a little bit, but that's a much improved result compared to this time last year. And so I think they are, I want to see a couple more race weekends at a couple more different tracks. We have Australia coming up, then we have Japan. So I think I want to get through April to see whether or not that's really, really true, but they seem well on their way, and I'm super happy to see the progress with that team. And then Logan Sargent, he was up in that battle. He ended up finishing at the back of the pack, considering, with those battles, but, he was thereabouts with Alex Albon. I don't, it wasn't a great weekend from him, but it wasn't last weekend. So,
yeah. So definitely some improvement on there for both those drivers, Logan Sargent and Nico Hulkenberg. Nico Hulkenberg, though, especially take a bow for getting a point for Haas, which looked quite impossible at the start of the season. So yeah, good job from them.
Yeah. I don't want to say impossible, but very improbable. I will say Logan Sargent being in his second season in F1 needs to start figuring out how to close the gap between Alex Albon, because and not because he needs to be closer to Alex Albon, because I don't think he's ever going to be that close to Alex Albon, because I just don't think he's on that level. But considering how competitive the back half of the field has been so far across the first two weekends, the difference between, 2 or 3 tenths a lap, it could be the difference between making Q3 and being knocked out in Q1.
Yeah.
And finishing and maybe scoring points and finishing at the back of the 16th, 17th, 18th. So, it is a close gap, but it's filled with a lot of drivers.
Mm-hmm.
So he has to figure out how to start bridging that gap in a more effective way. And then the last thing I talked about on the Grand Preview episode of Saudi Arabia was, the smoother track surface impacting tire wear for Ferrari and Haas. And I think we've talked about that enough. Seems to be the case. But, would like to see, maybe perhaps Ferrari or Australia and Japan before we get a really good idea, a really good read on what that is.
I keep forgetting that Japan is at the start of the season this year.
I know. I'm used to being it being
towards the end.
Towards the end. And I think they made that change for a couple reasons. One, because they're already in Australia. But two, where it is in September, October time, that's typhoon season. And we've seen several races in the past 5 years either be significantly rain impaired or have days of the weekend canceled because of typhoons. So I think it's just the weather is going to be a lot easier to deal with in Japan at the early start of the season. And they're, trying to finagle the Formula One schedule to make it much more regional specific, to be more sustainable. And that is also a part of that effort. So we are going to be seeing that after Australia. So which will be really good.
It'll be nice.
So what I thought was the most important part of the weekend, which you so greatly brought up beforehand, was that this was the first weekend for the F1 Academy being on that. So lots of changes to F1 Academy. I know we've talked about it a ton, but as a reminder, all of the Formula One teams have representation on the grid, from Chloe Chambers driving for Haas, Dorian Pain driving for Mercedes, Maya Woog driving for Ferrari, Abby Pulling driving for Alpine, Chloe Chambers driving for Haas, Leah Block driving for Williams, Hamda Al-Khabaisi driving for Red Bull, her sister Amna Al-Khabaisi driving for AlphaTauri, Racing Bulls, Carrie Schreiner driving for Sauber. So all of them, and then we have Lola Lovenfoss. And there are a couple other sponsors. The F1 Academy has a driver, which is Lola Lovenfoss. And then Neria Marti driving for Tommy Hilfiger. So all of the teams have some sort of Formula One or sponsor affiliation with them. All drivers do, which is great. All of their race weekends are taking place on Grand Prix weekends. And it was a wild weekend. It was completely dominated by Dorian Pain. Set pole position time that nobody else could match. I think only Abby Pulling was able to get relatively close, and it was like her qualifying gap between the top two was like 0.5 of a second. It was ridiculous how quick Dorian was. Won the first race, led every lap. The second race was really awkward because at the very end, after she had already received the checkered flag, she had gotten a 20-second time penalty because she did another racing lap. She took the checkered flag twice. She did another essentially lap at full speed after, which, is a cool down lap. That's when, people are coming out onto the track. It broke regulation protocol. So she was handed a 20-second time penalty, which promoted Abby Pulling to the race win. And so the points going in after were Dorian Pain obviously leading or actually not now. So Abby Pulling is actually leading the championship in F1 Academy. It was a great weekend for F1 Academy.
It was so cool to see, and it was also really cool to see how well it was received all across the Formula One grid. See
Mhm.
like all the supporters and everyone who came out for the race. It was really cool.
Yeah, there were some
And then
great pictures.
seeing Susie Wolf waving the checkered flag at the
Yeah,
end of the race. Oh, that was just so cool.
which was absolutely incredible. The mastermind and the fearless leader behind F1 Academy getting to wave the checkered flag. Yeah, it was great. And yeah, you mentioned that, it had a lot of buy-in from all of the F1 teams. There were great moments that were captured for social media with George Russell and Lewis Hamilton spending some time with Dorian Pin, and Maya Wood getting to spend some time with the Ferrari drivers, with Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Charles Leclerc in particular, because Carlos Sainz was in the hospital. But yeah, it was great. It's very well received. The competition and the field top to bottom is awesome. And if you and the racing at the Jeddah Corniche circuit was incredible. So if you have not watched any of F1 Academy so far this season, if you didn't get a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. And if you're in the United States, ESPN is airing it.
Which is
So,
something that hasn't been happening before.
right.
So it's really
And
exciting.
so last year, one of the biggest criticisms of the series was that it wasn't being televised. And we really only got updates from live timing and scoring from F1 Academy itself. I know I kept up with it because of what I was seeing on, either F1 journalists or the F1 Academy social medias, what they were posting during race weekends.
Mhm.
But this year, it's all televised. We get to watch it. And
Which is
particularly for us in the States, it's on ESPN,
really cool.
which is awesome. And it threw up some great racing. And I'm really, really excited for their next round, which I believe is, I want to say Austria, but I'm going to look it up because I don't want to be wrong. Their next race will be in Miami.
Oh,
So they will, in 2 months, they'll be at Miami. And then at the end of June, they'll be at Barcelona. At the end of August, they'll be at Zandvoort. At the end of September, they'll be at Singapore. At the end of November and the beginning of December, they'll be in Qatar. And then a week later, they have their finale when F1 has their finale at the Yas Marina circuit in Abu Dhabi. So great season so far. Abby Pulling leading the championship course. Abby Pulling is an original W Series driver who has driven and been very competitive in the W Series and is now making her second start, second season in the series, in the F1 Academy series, and driving for on the Alpine Academy team, and for the foreseeable future, likely going to be the only Alpine driver standing on a Formula One podium
oh gosh, yeah,
for for at least this season.
yeah,
The only
definitely
time
this season.
Alpine's getting to the podium is when Abby Pulling is going to be on it. And I don't say if, I say when, because she is blindingly fast.
Yeah, she's very good.
So that should just about do it for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix review. Any final thoughts or anything?
Do you want to say anything, Cannoli? Huh?
Like, no, Dad, put me down.
No. Okay.
But any final thoughts on the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix?
I just thought it was a good race. Yeah, overall, I thought it was good. It was very entertaining. Good racing the whole weekend with the F1 Academy and everything. So yeah, it was a good race. Looking forward to Australia in 2 weeks.
Yep, looking forward to that. And I will say, my final thought is the gap between the top and the bottom for qualifying. I mean, the races are obviously very spread out because of how good Max Verstappen is.
Yeah.
But at least in terms of qualifying, it was another race weekend, just like Bahrain, where it was incredibly close. It was awesome to see and how close and competitive it is, and it makes qualifying so entertaining.
Oh yeah,
I
for
I
sure.
I was I truly had no idea what was going to happen in qualifying. even though we've already kind of gotten an idea of what the pecking order is, I had no idea what was going to happen in qualifying because it's so close, which is going to make for an awesome season moving forward. But like you, very much looking forward to Australia. It's a track that, at least for me, is very near dear to my heart because that was the first ever F1 race that we watched together, was at Australia. I believe it was the 2002 Australian Grand Prix. Way back in, that would have been first grade. That would have been first grade.
First grade, I think, yeah.
Spring of 2002, first grade. So way back when, watching that race together, when we watched the recap of it because it was at 3 a.m. on the Speed channel.
Oh, the good old Speed channel.
So that's a race that's always brings back some nostalgia for, and for some older F1 fans that have been watching for several years, with it being the former traditional start to the F1 season, is going to bring back a lot of nostalgia. And the improvements that they made last year on the track were incredible, and I'm looking forward to F1 going back.
Yep, me too.
So looking forward, we will come back with another weekly episode next weekend on our off weekend from Formula One, and then the following week we'll have our Australian Grand Prix preview episode, and then we have the Australian Grand Prix. But until then, make sure you like and subscribe on all of our social medias. If you like this video or episode in an audio platform, please feel free to give us a 5-star review, hit the thumbs up button, and share with your friends. We are now on Apple Podcasts and iHeartRadio. So if you don't have Spotify or have something against Spotify for some reason and don't want to listen on Spotify, we are now on Apple Podcasts and iHeartRadio. So feel free to listen there and give us, please do us a solid and give us a good review over there. And until then, we'll see you next time.